Welcome on our talk about our research into security advisories and vulnerability prioritization in the wild. This is a research we conducted for National Cybersecurity Center for the Netherlands, NCC-NL. And we are Stephanie de Smale and Rick van Dijk. We're both researchers at NCC. And we conducted this research in collaboration with Michel van Eten from Delft University of Technology. So over this research, we looked into what happens when organizations receive information about possible vulnerabilities. And given that these organizations have a finite capacity to conduct security updates, we asked how do they prioritize the vast amount of vulnerability information and advisories which is published every day. So to start, at the yearly number of CVEs, we see a strong increase every year. As the graph shows here from CVE details, we started with around more than 4,000 in 2010, and 10 years later, we see there are almost 19,000 CVEs published every year, which isn't even the total amount of vulnerabilities found in hardware and software every year. But this indicates the growing stream of information and the growing need for organizations and CERTs to analyze and assess and communicate about these vulnerabilities, which takes a growing capacity for organizations and ourselves. So our main question was, how do organizations process vulnerability information and prioritize vulnerabilities? To start off, one of the tasks of the NCC is to inform our target groups on current vulnerabilities and analyze and assess them and communicate our assessments to them. We do that in the form of security advisories. So the NCC-NL has a risk score matrix, not unlike the CVSS score, to assess the vulnerability on basis of one, likelihood, and B, possible damage. And we publish these security advisories about recent vulnerabilities or threats in specific software or hardware. We publish around 1,000 security advisories each year. And here you see as well the steady increase from 2012, when there were 650 published. So here you see the growth in security advisories and the information we put out each year. And approximately every year, or in 2020, approximately 40 advisories were categorized as high. These are relatable to critical advisories or critical vulnerabilities. And we communicate these both through our security advisories and also through calls, indicating that they receive special attention from both us as well as of our target audiences. So looking at the vulnerability management field, we see that early research has found that users do not interpret the CVSS score consistently, and that the formula that is being used not always is sufficiently justified or validated. Adding to that is that prescriptive models that exist for organizations to organize vulnerability management and capacity, for example, SANS or Gartner, do not always have much empirical grounding. Moreover, they present a clear-cut path from immature to a mature posture for vulnerability management based on the use of tools, thresholds, and policies. While these current maturity models assume a perfect capacity and a perfect information position of these organizations, which is not always the case. As seen by research from Frank Lee, is that decisions are mostly influenced by organizational factors and processes. For example, as he has shown, is that the staggered deployment of updates implicitly trades off security for reliability. So for our research, we did 22 semi-structured interviews. Our goal, or our target population was the constituencies of NCC&L, which is a mix of small and large organizations, a mix of central government organizations and critical infrastructure, and the common denominator is that all these respondents receive NCC security advisories. So looking at the organization's size of our respondents, we interviewed both very large organizations with more than 10,000 employees, smaller ones with less than 50 employees. Here you see also that there's a large diversity between the size of the incident response teams or teams. Some are very small, some have multiple incident response teams. Interestingly, is that the size of the organization not always correlates one-on-one with the size of the incident response team. So when we talk about large organization in this context, we don't necessarily mean the total size of employees, but we mean that these organizations have either a large security team or a large incident response team. We see a lot of small organizations with a big IT focus, which have a more complex IT infrastructure and a larger security team than large organizations with a less IT focused organization. So who were the recipients of vulnerability information that we interviewed? The largest group we interviewed were security analysts, followed by CISOs. And interestingly is that some of the small organizations we interviewed is that they combine both the role of security officer and system admin, which means that these organizations have people that both look at the inflow of organizations and assessment, but also are responsible for the remediation of these vulnerabilities. Whereas larger organizations with, for example, security operations centers have dedicated analysts who only analyze and assess the information, then pass it on through to the people responsible for remediations. My colleague will talk a little bit more about our research into that. So what were our interview topics? We looked at the inflow of security advisories and other forms of vulnerability information. We looked at how this information was processed by organizations, how they assess the information, and how they prioritize the received information and vulnerabilities. We also looked at the remediation process of vulnerabilities. So now my colleague Stephanie will dive into our research results.
Okay, so I will take it from here and provide more details about the results of our study. So back to the main question, how do organizations process and prioritize vulnerability information? We've created a simplified workflow, as you see here, and this is by no means a management model. So what we intended to do is look at how vulnerability information is processed in practice, so in real life in organizations, because there is no perfect information, there's limited capacity. So how do organizations deal with these limitations? So what are their coping mechanisms? And bringing back the workflow into 4 categories. So the inflow, how information is received, where it is received, who receives the information, how is it looked upon, how is the information assessed and by whom, what is how is urgency and relevance of a specific vulnerability determined. Then how is a potential vulnerability remediated, how is it prioritized and mitigated, and the last step, how is a vulnerability remediated vulnerability evaluated and is feedback provided if a reporting process is in place. So what are the key observations of the study? We will go into detail in the next slide, so I will dissect them one by one, but the key observations are that the majority of respondents learn about vulnerabilities reactively. whilst a minority proactively searches for vulnerabilities. And I will go back into these remarks in more detail in the next slides. Second, the formalization of vulnerability assessment depends on the triage capacity of the organization. Third, the security advisories sent by authorities aid in creating urgency and necessity for mitigation. And lastly, vulnerability reporting depends on the organization of triage and the specific type of vulnerability. Now, diving into the first key observation, reactive learning versus proactive searching, we found that the mailbox, unsurprisingly, is a central node for the inflow of vulnerability information. It is where individuals receive newsletters and also security advisories about vulnerabilities, but also mail from vendors about specific relevant vulnerabilities. But it's also a form of a reactive form of receiving information. And the majority of these, for all organizations, the mailbox was a central node. And another form of how individuals reactively learn about vulnerabilities is that the majority of respondents relied on trusted third parties to provide information on relevant vulnerabilities. And this is one form of a coping mechanism where if there is limited capacity to look for vulnerabilities, or to make sense of the high of the amount of vulnerabilities, then organizations tend to rely on those organizations that provide that filtering process for them. NCSC is one of them, but others, specifically the example used here, ICS CERT, if organizations with OT security tend to rely on third parties such as ICS CERT to filter relevant vulnerabilities for them. So, and if we look at sources used by organizations to look for vulnerabilities, then we see that vendors are sourced used most frequently. And what I forgot to mention here is that NCSC is left out in this graph, but it's a given that NCSC is a source used because all the respondents already receive security advisories by the NCSC. That's why we left it out in the graph. Other sources often used are security websites, so a variety of national and international websites are used, but also vulnerability scanners. So what we see is that as opposed to other sources which are more based on the personal interest of specific security analysts, there are scanners have a special place in that they're more of a proactive form of seeking out vulnerability information. Which brings us to the last point, is that specifically medium to large organizations are more inclined to use vulnerability scanners to actively search for vulnerabilities and are regarded as an important source in asking respondents the question, which type of information is most important for you. Then we see that scanners are as important as information received by trusted third parties, and such as the National Cybersecurity Center or vendors. Going into the second category, assessment, we see that the risk assessment in security advisories plays an important role in the prioritization and assessment of the organization, and particularly this is not exclusively for small organizations, but it is a coping mechanism that that smaller organizations tend to rely more on the risk assessment done by authorities and vendors, because they don't often have the capacity to do all the assessments themselves. And secondly, the small organizations, the assessment is done by the receiver of information, and also the remediation is done by the receiver of the information, and that's because many of the respondents have had a dual role, so they were both system admin and a security officer. So it would make sense that this individual runs through the entire process workflow of from the inflow to the assessment to the remediation, as opposed to large organizations which have different roles, different teams for each part of the workflow. And there you see that the roles are much more spread out and far apart from each other. And lastly, the received information is checked against public sources, and here we see a difference again between smaller and larger organizations. That larger organizations have automated and formalized these checks on third parties. And again, this is a capacity issue. If you have a large incident response team, and if you have, for instance, DevOps capacity in your team, then it's much more easy to automate these things than if you are operating solo, which makes it harder to proactively formalize these these checks. Going into the third category, security advisories. What we saw, organizations appoint roles or teams to track and lead remediation processes effectively. And there's a difference between organizations that have highly formalized processes and organizations that have more ad hoc processes. So we saw, on the one hand, organizations with formalized processes will have a crisis manual which say, in event of this and this vulnerability, we'll scale up and we have this specific team, as opposed to an ad hoc organization that much more takes a case-by-case view and looks at the specific vulnerability and then assembles a team. And a second point is that security advisories are used by the majority of recipients to advocate mitigating measures. And this was an interesting find, that advisories sent by the NCSC had a have authority in higher management actually were used as a measure for persuading management to mitigate specific vulnerabilities. And lastly, what we saw here in remediation processes, that internal SOCs were much more involved in the whole process than external SOCs. So what we saw is that if you look at the whole cycle from inflow to assessment to remediation to reporting, external SOCs were very active in the inflow and sending information to the organizations, but not much involved in the whole assessment and remediation processes, as opposed to internal SOCs who took a more active stance, were part of the crisis structure, and involved in also the remediation and reporting process. So lastly, if we look at the reporting phase, this was highly dependent on the type of organization. However, in case of a critical vulnerability, the reporting phase became important in all organizations. So all organizations wanted to know what were the measures, when was it patched, and is the vulnerability remediated, yes or no? And here there's a difference between ad hoc organizations who have where reporting is less of a structured, less structural, and for highly formalized organizations which have a reporting phase built into their whole cycle. Secondly, here we saw, smaller organizations have less formalized reporting processes. This makes sense because, as I mentioned earlier, particularly those that have individuals which have a dual role have less use of a reporting process because the groups are so small. And what we saw in an interesting way to formalize these processes is that ticketing systems play a central role in reporting and tracking the vulnerability triage process, because they can be assigned and tracked, and around the ticketing system, a process is formalized. So what are the key takeaways from these insights? Is that organizations have coping mechanisms to process vulnerability information. Think, for instance, of about using trusted third parties to filter information. Secondly, risk assessments of trusted third parties kickstarts own vulnerability triage processes. What we saw particularly relevant here is the risk assessment done by the NCSC, which was used in this. Third, security advisories sent by authorities aid in creating urgency and necessity for mitigation. So using advisories for higher management. And lastly, the reporting and evaluation phase is particularly relevant for critical vulnerabilities. And here we see a difference between organizations which have ad hoc processes and organizations which have highly formalized processes in how important this reporting and evaluation phase is. So here are some of the works that we cited, and this was our presentation. This was a pilot study, and we're looking to collaborate to conduct a comparative study of vulnerability triage and other certs. So if you are interested, please contact us. You can email us at research@ncsc.nl, and we've just started up this research. So if you're interested in joining us, please let us know. So this was our presentation. My colleague Rick and I are very happy to take your questions. So I will end it here, and I hope everybody has fun at the remaining conference. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see each other soon. Bye.